The recording, I think, started almost exactly when we had 200 people on. So that is perfect timing. Welcome. I'm glad to see everybody here tonight. This is the New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club. I'm your host, Ron Kursop. Tonight's session will be discussing everybody's favorite topic, financial planning and budgeting. I counted up our sessions and was talking to our group ahead of time, and this is going to be our I think our 15th Trustee Handbook Book Club session, which means that we've produced, after tonight, we'll have produced almost 23 hours of content. If you've watched or listened to all 23 hours of content, congratulations. I know that the group, Rebecca and Jerry, and our guest speakers that we've had to date have worked really hard to get all this up and running, and we hope that you've gotten a lot out of this over the time that we've been putting it on. The purpose of the New York State Trustee Handbook Book Club is to make sure that we can provide explanations and insights for the more than 6,000 library trustees in New York State. Each book club session takes a deeper dive into one chapter of the trustee handbook and answers real-life questions received from the field that arise in the area of governance work for library boards. If you could take a look at the bottom of your screen, you should see a Q&A button and a chat button. If you have a question that comes up during the session as we're going through the presentation tonight, or if something comes to your mind that you want to ask our presenters about, go ahead and put it right in that Q&A function. I'll be monitoring these tonight to make sure that we're able to answer the questions that come in. If we don't get to your questions tonight, we'll save them and we'll try to answer them in a future session. If you look at the chat box, you can use that to send information. We'll be sending links out. For now, I know a lot of you have already done this, but I invite you to test it out. Go ahead and introduce yourself. Let us know your name, your library, how long you've been a trustee, and just say hi. And you'll get to know your colleagues around the state a little bit better. I won't be able to say hi to everybody, but I'm really glad that you're here. And I look forward to seeing your names pop up in chat. Before we get too far in tonight's program, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge our co-promotional sponsors. So thank you very much to the New York State Library, the Public Library Systems Directors Organization, the Library Trustee Association, and the Public Library section of NYLA. Without you, we would not be able to have such a great turnout that we do. So thank you so much. So as I said, tonight, we're going to be talking about financial planning and budgeting. Over the next 90-ish minutes, we will receive an overview of the topic and we'll discuss answers to frequently asked questions sent in advance by our viewers. Following that, I will facilitate a Q&A with those in attendance during the live session. Again, go ahead and place any questions that you have in that Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. I'm going to keep an eye on those and we will make sure that we do our best to answer those. Two common questions that we receive, I can answer for you right now. The first one is, will this session count towards the trustee education requirement? Yes, it will. And will there be a certificate of attendance? Yes, and that will come from the Mid-Hudson Library System. We just ask that you be patient because we have to make sure that we're able to verify and all that good stuff. So once this session's over, you'll receive a certificate of attendance after the fact. So just keep an eye out for that. Tonight, we have one of the authors of the Trustee Handbook, Rebecca Smith-Aldrich, and we are also joined by Brian Hildreth, who is my co-moderator that tonight is going to do some of the presenting. I'd also like to say hi to Laura. She's from the Mid-Hudson Library System, and she'll be helping us out with any technical problems that might come up. So I'm sure a lot of you already know Rebecca Smith-Aldrich. She is the Executive Director of the Mid-Hudson Library System, and along with co-authoring the Handbook for Library Trustees of New York State, she has also authored the Companion Handbook for New Library Directors in New York State and the Municipal How-To Guide, as well as 2 ALA editions. Brian Hildreth, I'm sure you know him too. He's been moderating alongside me on these Trustee Handbook book clubs since the very beginning. Brian's the Director of the Southern Tier Library System, where he supports his member libraries in planning, budget, trustee education. We're really happy to have Brian talking about financial planning and budgeting tonight at the Trustee Handbook Book Club. So at this time, I'd like to go ahead and invite Rebecca and Brian to kick us off with our next installment. Take it away, guys.
Thanks so much, Ron. We're thrilled to be here tonight to take a deeper dive on the topics of financial planning and budgeting. But before we get started, I just wanted to thank Brian for stepping up from the role of moderator to presenter for tonight. I always enjoy working with Brian, and I've worked with him for many years, I think almost over a decade now, on a variety of projects. But one of our shared passions is sustainable funding for libraries. And this topic feeds right into that. And we are going to talk about that tonight. But we wanted to do, and I know this topic, you might think to yourself, oh, they've done this one already. But we're going to take a narrower look at these two aspects of your fiscal oversight role as a volunteer trustee of your library. And we think that's pretty important given the challenges that many of you are facing and all of us are facing in a interesting economy that we all operate within. So our goal here tonight is to give you some very practical advice, things that are tried and true that work well for libraries, and some things that many libraries maybe haven't thought of in a while, to give you maybe some ammunition for why you might want to think differently about planning in the future. So Brian, thank you for being here today. So this might look familiar to you. Your job as a trustee, right? This document, the statement on the governance role of a trustee or board member, is something that we've shared a couple of times throughout this series and is mentioned in the trustee handbook. And you'll know it's super clear that you're providing fiscal oversight for the organization that you are a trustee of. And when we talked about budgeting and finance in the earlier session back in January 2022, we really focused broadly on that oversight role, the role of the fiduciary to make sure the money is being used wisely as intended. It's a reasonable use of taxpayer dollars and some of the key things you need to do in that oversight process. But it's not just the oversight of perhaps the monthly minutia, as some people refer to it as, but it's taking both the short-term and long-term view of the finances of the library. The decisions that you make today at the board table really leave a financial legacy for the library, whether it be good financial planning that shores up the future of the library or figuring out past problems that perhaps have developed because of chronic underfunding. These are things that you perhaps have inherited as you joined the library board. But it's your opportunity at this point in the library's history to really think about the fiscal future of your library. So of course, we want to reinforce the oversight nature of your job on a monthly basis, but we're going to talk a little broader today. We're going to start first by talking about the budget process itself, who does what that timeline looks like, but then really kind of step back and take a broader view about what does it look like to have a library that's going to be adequately funded in the years to come. So this is also part of that fiscal oversight role. Brian, did you want to add up this slide?
Yeah, I think one of the things that we're going to touch upon a few times tonight is just this, general idea of duty of care. And we talked about this in previous sessions. And, what do our outcomes look like when, we're engaged in the process and, we're present and we're showing up and we're doing our homework and we're coming up with really thoughtful questions. And then we're asking those questions of our director and our finance committee and our treasurer and, our internal auditor. And, I think that's a really good place to start for tonight. The other thing that I think is really important is just recognizing and embracing the diversity of our library boards. I think one of the things that are so wonderful about boards is the fact that they bring a diverse perspective as well as knowledge base to the table. And it's okay if you don't have necessarily a background in budgeting or finance and accounting. Lean on those individual trustees that do and really ask a lot of good questions of them so that as you're going through the process of fiscal oversight, you're truly understanding the financial house of the organization. And, the other thing I'll say about this is through that active participation, you're actually taking a very great leadership role in that process because you're providing the checks and balances that the full governance role of the board needs in order to take care of the financial house of the organization.
So as we always like to say, it's not just the treasurer's responsibility to understand the finances of the library, right? It's everyone's responsibility. And so this ties into what the other really important role that you've got as a library trustee, which is that of planning. And of course, we've talked about planning throughout this series, and these two things are intimately tied together. And we pulled this quote from the trustee handbook because it's one of the most important pieces to understand about how it actually all works, right? The best budgets need to be developed in relationship to the library's long-range plan, that strategic planning process that you've invested so much time into to understand your community's needs and aspirations needs to be brought to life through budgeting. And so I think that the idea here of actually translating your plans into action, that takes money as a catalyst. That's what we're here to talk about tonight. How do you make that kind of turning the corner to actually bring that to life? And then how do you concurrently be keeping an eye on the future and thinking about the implications of choices that you're making today and the outside forces that impact the budget of the library over time?
Yeah, and I think I'll just reiterate a lot of Rebecca's points. And at this moment, I don't think we're talking about budgeting. We're really talking more about strategic planning. And for any libraries that have done that work, you know that it's not nothing. Like, you have to go out into your community and you have to put your listening ears on and, really roll up your sleeves and dig deep and hear from your community members about their aspirations and their needs and how the library really plays a role in that. And you're listening to community members that have a voice and that are in positions of leadership, but you're also doing your very best to listen to community members that don't necessarily have a voice. And so, you take those lessons that you're learning, you bring them back to the library, and you work with staff and trustees, for me as a director, and work with friends and foundation to put pen to paper and really come up with some really good goals and objectives that align the library's mission with community aspirations and needs. But like Rebecca's talking about, it's important that you invest in what those needs are, because you go through this really exhaustive process of putting together this wonderful plan. And then all of a sudden, when you come to the table to start doing the budgeting things, you really need to financially prioritize those things that your community members want you to make good on, in terms of, fulfilling good fiscal stewardship of the role of the public library within your community.
So I think we find over and over again that we all have very good intentions, right? We want to produce quality library services for the people that we serve, but are we actually having the impact that we intended in those goal statements we put into those plans? Here's where we start to really figure out how we're going to have that desired impact, not just good intentions. And so I think the partnership aspect of budget development needs to be stressed during our time with you here during this session. And it goes back to this old mantra, right? Like, boards and directors are a team. You are teaming up to produce a wonderful library for your community, but there's certainly different roles and responsibilities that each side takes in these processes. So when you think about the difference between planning and budgeting, obviously you're doing some planning while you're budgeting, but the strategic planning process where you're bringing in input from your community to really understand how to design services, programs, collections, and partnerships that respond to what your community needs. You have a role in that work, as we've discussed previously in this series, and we will be doing once again through this series, but you're participating in that process, you're reviewing data that's brought to the table, you're adopting that final vision of your strategic plan of how this library is going to meet the goals of this community. And your director is helping, is facilitating this process and recommending to you the proper responses from a library to the needs that have been identified through your process. The budgeting aspect of this is really the implementation of this plan. It's not just the director's job to figure out how we're going to make this all work. The board has to make sure adequate funding is available and it's allocated properly to bring those goals to life. So often when we'll see a director evaluation take place and trustees will be frustrated, they'll say, we didn't really advance our strategic goals at all. And then you take a look at there's really usually a disconnect there between the budget and the plan. And the director's been really not well resourced to carry out the vision that the board has created thanks to that input from the community. So I think approaching both aspects of this work on your board with excitement, this is the work, right? This is the stuff. This is where the magic happens, as they say, to create a wonderful library. It takes this forethought as well as the practical application of dollars to bring it all to life.
And Rebecca took the words out of my mouth. So I was going to say excitement. So I'm going to use the word enthusiasm. So I get that, like, strategic planning isn't for everybody. And I also know that, like, some people don't really get excited about budgeting. I love doing budgeting. And as much as I know strategic plan is important, I'm not always excited about it as maybe some of my colleagues. I enjoy it, but I'm not as excited about it with them. And so, that's the reason why we have the word teamwork up here on this slide. If you refer back to the trustee handbook, there's this wonderful diagram in the back that talks about the 7 components of shared responsibilities between director and board. And in this diagram, I would argue that the 3 most important components of it are planning, budgeting, but also policy development. And these 3 things right here are kind of like the architectural blueprints of how not only the people that participate in your civic space as a public library, but also how people view your library from the outside, whether they're a library user or just a proud community member that is really grateful for the fact that you have a wonderful public library in your community. But again, going back to the idea of, as much as maybe it's not within your wheelhouse to get excited about these things, collectively, you as a board and working in partnership with your director really do have to get excited about them because they are part of that architectural blueprint.
So what we wanted to do is to really take a look step by step at the budgeting process and really walk through who does what on what timeline. And I'm going to ask Brian to take the lead here on this.
Yeah. So it's a kind of a 5-step process, and really where step number 1 starts. It starts with the director, and I don't make this recommendation because I've been a director for 20 years. I make this recommendation because that's really the most appropriate place for the budgeting process to start. For you as trustees, you've hired this individual to be one of the most financially competent individuals within the organization, to set the vision for the organization and really lead the library forward. It's also the person that probably has the most intimate details about the budget. They know on a daily basis and weekly and monthly basis about the monies that are coming in and the monies that are going out. They're also working on the front lines. They're communicating with staff and they're communicating with patrons. They're participating in meetings all across the community. They're hearing from community members about what the needs of the library are. So that's why we really advocate that the budgeting process starts with the library director. And depending upon the director, it can start anywhere from 120 to 150 days out from the time that you're supposed to put your budget into place. Step 2 is the director bringing those financial documents, that proposed budget, to the finance committee. And we recognize the fact that every library is different. Some of you operate on a school district fiscal year, some of you operate on a municipal fiscal year, and some of you operate on a calendar fiscal year. But having the director bring this proposed budget to the finance committee, it's the first temperature check of the board. It brings a small sample of the board together around this document to review it, to understand it, and to ask some really good questions, and then also offer up some suggestions. So it's kind of like the initial negotiation process. And then once the finance committee and the director are on the same page about what they want to present to the board, they bring this document to the board about 60 days before the start of the fiscal year. And that's the board's first opportunity to start looking at those numbers, again, understanding it, asking questions of the finance committee and the director in partnership who are presenting that information, and then sitting with it. And so for the next 30 days, the board gets to sit with that document and do their own research and refer back to that strategic plan, and really remember that there are some things out there that need to be funded, and make sure that when you go into step number 4, which is hopefully the approval of this document, or at least the vote upon this budget, that you really try to align that strategic plan with the budget that the director, the finance committee, and now the full board has been able to review. So it's your hope that 30 days out from the start of your fiscal year that the board votes upon this budget. There's been a lot of transparency in the process, questions have been answered, and everybody's been bringing each other along, and you vote upon it and it passes. It is important to note, if your library intends to override the tax cap or is not sure what that tax cap is, but thinks that they're going to come close to overriding the tax cap, always make sure that the board passes passes a resolution to override that tax cap. And that's absolutely key when you get into the points of where you're going to actually put this budget up for vote to the taxpayers through your funding referendum, if you have a public vote. And then step number 5 is the director takes that information and files the tax cap form with the New York State Comptroller's Office.
And Brian, I'm glad you brought up the tax cap, and I know we'll be talking more about this, but I just wanted to note that in New York State, there's a variety of ways that folks facilitate a vote on the budget. And so as we think about how that falls into this timeline, your mileage may vary depending on if you're a district, school district library, a special district public library that has a unique identifier date. You might be using the 259 school district ballot, which might happen in May. It might happen on a date of the library board's choosing. 414 votes also are happening the date of the general election and impact this process perhaps on a slightly different linear line, but not in the terms of the timing that it takes to get the work done. So we don't have enough time tonight to go through all those different variations, but I think this is a very solid way to get to the moment at which the board needs to have solid information to make decisions from, whether it's what you're presenting to the board, to a municipality, or that you're operating with for that year. So I just want to thank Brian for putting this this together and putting pen to paper on it, because this is a new resource that we've developed through the series, thanks to Brian's work on this topic.
And I would ask, we're not going to address it right now because we want to make sure we get through the slides, but I would entertain a question from the group about what happens if the board doesn't actually come to agreement on that budget in step number 4. So what's the next step forward? So we'll get to that if you guys ask that question later.
And I just wanted to give a little more context here for the property tax cap, right? The processes or the procedural aspects of the property tax cap were not written with libraries in mind. When you read any of the documentation related to it, it refers to school districts and to municipalities. You need to keep in mind that libraries were ruled to fall on the municipal side of that law. And so that's the timeline that you use for your filing of the forms. And you need to remember there are implications for you if you do not file that form. You may have to pay back taxpayers if you don't file that form appropriately. You could lose out on the allowable carryover that could be there for you at 1.5% if you didn't ask for an increase the year before. So there's definitely financial implications for not following what is actually a very simple process. So any library that has their own board, which is pretty much all of you, there's only 2 libraries in the whole state that doesn't have their own board. So I'm pretty sure they're not on the call here tonight. And if you have a public vote on your budget at any point in the library's history, even if you did it once 10 years ago, you never went again, still required to file that tax cap form. So really, really critical part of the process that needs to be way more visible probably throughout the library community here in New York moving forward. So you've got this process in place, you've developed your budget. We're going to talk a little more about what goes into developing that budget in just a minute. But first we want to talk about monitoring that budget, because we want to really reinforce for you that the budget you're putting together is a plan. It's with the data you have in hand at that moment, and things definitely change. So making sure you've got your finger on the pulse of how it's going through those monthly budget reports we mentioned in the other session on this topic, and comparing it to how things went perhaps the year before. Are we in line with the budget we adopted for this year? But recognizing that revenues might change over time, expenditures might change over time. We got a crash course in that over the course of the pandemic, as we saw major supply chain issues impact both supplies for just regular everyday things like office supplies, books on the shelf, to really strongly impacting construction projects over the past 3 years. So we have to find flexibility, and you also need to have policies and procedures that allow you to adjust as necessary in response to the data in real time. So making sure your board has a budget amendment policy and procedure is quite key. It's something that in our own audit of our member library policies here in the Mid-Hudson Library System, we've noticed is missing from quite a few policy collections. I'm not looking at anyone in particular. I'll just put that out there. And then allowing for mid-year budget adjustments to really bring into alignment where your budget projections are about 6 months into your fiscal year, and getting a clean look at how our fiscal standing is in light of how money actually arrived into the organization, what money is going out, and how plans have had to be adjusted over time. So having a director approach the board with a perhaps relatively minor budget adjustment, I'm sure you're not too concerned about, but it's those major budget adjustments, and major is different depending on the context of your finances, but that has to be defined in policy so your director knows when to come back to the board and what flexibility they have to make things work in the course of doing the business of the library.
And I was excited to see that Jerry Nichols, our colleague, is joining us tonight. And so I have to give Jerry credit for this, but something he's always taught us is that good administrators understand that the budget is merely a tool. It's a tool in your tool belt that you use to basically manage the finances of the organization. And like Rebecca said, it needs to be flexible. And the other thing mid-year budget adjustments do, in addition to encouraging the behavior of continually checking in from one month to the next about where you are in finances and where the overages are and where the underages are, or the being under is, it really allows you to be transparent. And, think about, Rebecca mentioned the pandemic, think about those of our libraries that were operating on a calendar fiscal year. And, you approved your budget in November or December of 2019. And then all of a sudden the first quarter of 2020 hit, your world completely changed. Instead of investing in, analog or print collections, or maybe outreach and going to community events, now you're increasing the number of loanable Wi-Fi hotspots that you're offering, you're putting external Wi-Fi access points on your buildings, you're pumping money into your digital content. And so like those changes in real time have to be accounted for from like a public document standpoint. And so what does it look like when you're 9 to 10 months into your fiscal year and you realize what you're over on and what you're under on, and bringing those line items or those chart of accounts within your budget into alignment based on what actual spending is versus what you budgeted 9 to 10 months ago. And then you present that in a public document. Taxpayers look at that information. And when they see that information, they show that you're engaged with that financial document and you're really doing the checks and balances that you should be doing as appointed and elected officials to make sure that you're spending money wisely and you're doing it in tandem with the plan of service that is also a public document.
So great segue, Brian, to the whole idea of financial planning in terms of what you're putting in that budget and looking at trends over time, as well as protecting the library and managing risk into the future. So as we think about some of the key things that are impacting libraries today, we've got to point out personnel costs are something that are often woefully underfunded in some libraries. And it's really to the detriment of service to our communities as we see a revolving door, perhaps in a particular position, or even in the director position, if we haven't really competitively priced and benefited that position. So as we start to think about how we are comparing salaries and benefits across the aisle to other libraries, perhaps in your county or your region, we have to also understand that not every library you're comparing yourself to has really thought that through either. So making sure that we're comparing what we're paying our staff to other nonprofit leadership roles, perhaps in the community, and thinking a little more competitively about this to make sure we not only can attract, but retain quality staff in our libraries. So we're encouraging folks, particularly in light of the recent law that was passed in the state budget this year, to really take a hard look at the projections for minimum wage. As we think about the progression over the next 3 years, at least, of increases to minimum wage, we then see a pivot point where the increases to minimum wage will be tied to inflation, which is going to create variability and volatility in what the minimum wage will be moving forward. So as we start to think about what is the lowest price point for staff in our organizations, we may want to shift to thinking about a living wage in our organizations rather than just the minimum wage to more adequately and equitably pay our staff, but also to protect against that volatility that's going to come when that switch is flipped and they change the way they'll be calculating increases to minimum wage. I'll also point out benefit packages, of course, another volatile area of a library's budget, but something that you'll see will soon hamper you if you haven't spent enough time thinking about it. And of course, there's what you wish you could have and what you can afford. And sometimes there's a gap there. And so this is part of what we're talking about with financial planning is gap analysis. Where are you today? Where do you want to be? And what are the steps to get there? And what are you going to do in terms of the timeline to get to those steps? So as we think about financial planning, it might not be tomorrow, it might not be next year's budget, but we want to see progression over the next few years of achieving the levels that you understand you're going to need to be at to be a viable library for the future. This goes hand in hand with just the way you think about your facility as well. Those of you that are overseeing your own facility that the board owns, you know you need to invest on a regular basis, from preventative maintenance to upkeep to making sure the building actually meets the needs of your community in the year 2023, 2024, and 2030, as compared to maybe 1975 when the last renovation was done in that building. Again, those are big ticket items that maybe can't be done overnight, but require fiscal planning and a facility plan that understands the goals of the organization. You're seeing other pressures on your budget right now from e-resources. The digital collection development area of our budgets is something that we have struggled to keep up with nationwide in libraries. And it's going to be a continual complicated area for library directors to be doing projections in based on skyrocketing demand and also monopolized digital collection ownership and licensing from our vendors, which makes a mix for directors that is very, very challenging to figure out how to budget for in the future. But we know is these major format shifts are going to be impacting our budget, and we need to think differently about how we're developing collections for the future. The other big areas we see of growth is obviously program expansion. Gone are the days of hoping someone will come and volunteer to do programming, right? This is one of our major growth areas in libraries is programs. And so thinking about how we're investing adequately in programming, paying staff adequately to do programming, making sure we're getting licensing for movies and we're getting speakers that are coming in that are doing a quality job on behalf of our communities, all takes investment. And so as we grow, to meet the needs of our communities over time, what we want is to not have trustees have sticker shock in 1 year as they realize all the realities of what it takes to build a wonderful library for the community, but to be smart and to look at the trends and to understand what's coming. So we're building in steps to our asks to our public to justify, of course, what we're doing, but also to move the organization forward at a reasonable pace that is palatable to our taxpayers.
I think it's pretty evident that Rebecca's passionate about this. So the one thing that I'll share is just start with expenses first. And I think that's a really important thing to talk about. So Rebecca talks through like all the potential forecasts of things that we can anticipate in the coming years. But one of the things that I think is really helpful for libraries to at least pivot to the next things that we're going to talk about, which is multi-year financial planning and reserve funds. But just start with expenses first. A lot of libraries get in this habit of taking a look at what revenues look like and then identifying, okay, how do we fit the library's service program within those revenues that we receive? And we're going to talk about sustainable funding as well. But we're naturally programmed to do that because that's how we do our personal finances. Like we know what we're going to make throughout the year and we know what our income looks like. And so, you know, we adjust our expenditures based on the fact of what we need to survive, and then also maybe some luxuries that we can fit in with that budget. But when it comes to running a library, you really need to focus on expenses first and go through that suite of services that you need, that you know that you need and want to offer, you know, whether that's expansion of collections, taking into account, you know, outreach to the community and really connecting with people that may not necessarily be coming into the library, or, you know, connecting with people through improved broadband connectivity and technology. And all of those things, when you go through that process and add up every single one of those line items, I guarantee you, like Rebecca mentioned, there's going to be a disconnect between what the true cost of offering those services are and what you actually receive on the revenue side. And that's okay. That doesn't necessarily mean you have to do something about it right now. But that's the financial planning part that Rebecca's talking about, is identifying what is the true cost on the expense side of providing services, recognizing the fact that there is a budget shortfall and the amount of revenue that you're taking in, at least sustainable revenue, secure revenue that's voted upon by the voters, may not necessarily be exactly where you need to be. And so that's where we started to get into thoughts about multi-year financial planning as well as sustainable funding, and identifying whether or not the current model that we're operating under within one specific library is the right model for us.
So all of these are bigger items that require savings. And Brian equated our personal financial planning approach to how we do work at the library. And this is something that we're often surprised at, that libraries are allowed to put money aside for very specific purposes that are justifiable. And you'll see a whole section in the trustee handbook on reserve funds. There's also a wonderful publication from the Office of the State Comptroller on reserve funds to give you guidance on what is appropriate to put money aside for and to save for over time. Hopefully you all have capital reserve funds. We talked about that in our facilities session and what that looks like. But you also may need it for other purposes, from cash flow to bridge the gap between the start of your fiscal year and when your tax dollars come in, or to help with other significant expenses that you can be confronted with in the course of a fiscal year, from benefits that have been accrued by a personnel that is leaving and you need to pay them out. These are things that maybe are unexpected but not unanticipated. So I think this is where we're talking about the planning aspect of the work that we do at the board table when it comes to budgeting. And just a reminder, with reserve funds, they need to be justified. They need to be authorized by the board through your board's reserve policies. And you need to have public accountability in terms of how they are reported on at your monthly meetings, as well as in your audit that's done by your certified public accountant.
Yeah, and I think to speak about it from a theoretical standpoint, there is a big difference between a library that has reserve funds and a library that doesn't. And, you know, I see this in the type of work that I do. And I think most folks that work within a system that get that global view of how libraries that operate, One of the things that make libraries so special and do really good work is they're able to pivot in a very quick manner. And so the other thing that they're able to do is take risk when sometimes, other organizations within the community aren't able to take on that risk. And having a reserve fund allows you to do that. Again, going back to the pandemic, libraries that recognized there was a real need for, personal protective equipment, PPE within their community, or recognized that there needed to be external access Wi-Fi hotspots on the outside of their buildings. Libraries that had reserve funds, they weren't waiting for those funds from like a granting agency or trying to free up money or make budget adjustments to do that work. They just went ahead and did that because they knew that they had the money in reserves to back them to do that type of work. Whereas if you have libraries that don't necessarily have those reserve funds, there is that constant thought of like, before we can go ahead with this really game-changing type service for our community members, or even life-changing type service for our community members, we have to think about the budget first and whether or not we can actually afford this, and can we make it through the next 9 more months of our fiscal year. And so, you've heard Rebecca give you the permission slip that, reserve funds are okay, obviously within the context of the law and the types of policies that you developed and how you're transparent about that with your community members. But it ties back again to personal finances too. We know that we can take more risk, and we know that we can do more good things and exciting things as individuals, but in the library setting, we can do more exciting things for our community members if we have those funds set aside, not just for a rainy day, but also for when our community calls on us because they need us.
So at this point, I think we're kind of issuing a call to action to be more strategic and thinking about the finances of libraries for the future. And that's why we've introduced something that's very commonly talked about in school districts and in municipalities. And there's a whole handbook on it from the Office of State Comptroller, but we rarely talk about it in our library land here in New York, multi-year financial planning. And sometimes it naturally happens in different areas of the budgeting process for your library, but a lot of times it's a wisdom holder in your organization, maybe the longtime treasurer or the director who's been there for a number of years kind of understands the trend lines of where things are going, but we haven't put pen to paper, which can be a recipe for disaster when you have turnover in those key positions that are tied to the library's finances. So thinking about setting those long-term priorities as they apply to your library's strategic plan, as they apply to the facility plan of the library, and then making sure your reserve fund strategy is supporting those long-term goals that you have. So we're not spending down reserve funds without a strategy behind taking money out of those areas. So I think it's, we definitely hear trustees over time thinking about the reserve funds of like, well, if something went wrong, we just take money of that fund. Well, that fund should already have a designated purpose. It shouldn't be the in case something goes wrong fund, right? We want to make sure they're not just one-time revenue fixers when something goes wrong or you don't get a grant that you were counting on. It needs to be really justified and put there for a purpose with very clear instructions in your policies for why money's coming out of those reserve funds. The other thing we're really looking for is that respect for the taxpayer. I've sat through many a meeting with members of the public who are in a budget hearing with a library and wondering why the library is sitting on all of this money. And we have to be able to explain and justify why that money is sitting there. And then in fact, it would be irresponsible not to have that money there for those specified purposes. This will also help to contextualize your fundraising and grant seeking goals and making sure you're not relying on fundraising and grants to keep the lights on at the library. So all of these things work together. And the handbook that the Office of the State Comptroller has put together, it certainly gives you guidance in how to do these projections, what areas of revenue and expenditures you can take a look at to help with multi-year financial planning. And it doesn't have to be super complicated. It could be the major categories of revenue and expense and just having a chat about what we know and what we need to know to be responsible in how we think about the planning for the library's finances in the coming years.
I think one of the things that a lot of libraries get really good at is budgeting from one year to the next. And I always refer to this as budgeting in an annual silo. And, as you're budgeting for that upcoming year, you look, if you're budgeting expenses first and then revenues, you might see, oh, we have a small budget shortfall. Let's take a little bit of money out of reserve funds. We'll have a carryover and we'll make next year's budget work. And then the next year you're doing this, annual budgeting silo thing again, where you're like, oh, we have another budget shortfall. Let's cut a little bit from collections. And also we can ask our director to write some grants to pick up those programs. And then you move on to the next year. And again, the same type of thing happens. And you start to incrementally chisel away at your budget. Eventually what ends up happening is you hit a wall. And, and there's solutions for libraries when that wall is hit. But the multi-year financial planning approach allows you to avoid that type of a situation. It also allows you to proactively plan for, instead of hitting that wall, to like really make a strong case to taxpayers and community members at why the library needs to do this. I think in our work through sustainable funding, I've been in the same type of public meeting rooms that Rebecca's been in. And the question also comes up, instead of, why is the library sitting on this money and why can't they spend it? The question comes up, why didn't the library come to us sooner with this issue? Why didn't you let us know what your money challenges were? And I think it dawns on trustees in that moment in time, like, oh, this isn't just a library board issue. This isn't just a library issue. This is a community issue that we all need to really figure out and solve together. Yeah, I think I'll stop there.
Well, that was good because it was really well said, and it leads directly to the next talking point, which is that sustainable funding, which is engaging with your community to allow them to have a say of how much to invest into the library that they all benefit from. And so when we use this phrase sustainable funding, we're really referring to that secure and stable funding source that has been decided upon by a public vote. And you want to make sure this funding is actually meeting community needs. Another gap analysis that we've been discussing here. We've got libraries that perhaps haven't recognized the fact that the state law empowers library boards to speak to voters on this topic. And library boards that have been shy about that or have felt like they couldn't justify going back again and again, has really created situations for many libraries in New York State where we're seeing this chronic underfunding is eroding the ability of a library to meet the community needs. So you'll hear Brian and I talk about this all the time because we've been literally in the trenches with our libraries, helping with these issues, trying to help libraries understand how the law has been designed to help libraries do the right thing. Because libraries are a public good. The idea here is that we all chip in so that the community is stronger for it. And knowing the mechanisms that are available to your library, whether it's the ideal model that's been put forth by the Board of Regents, as Jerry has mentioned many times over the course of this series, and being a school district public library or a special district public library, or being an association of municipal library that maybe for whatever reason you don't see a path forward to districts, but you're utilizing Section 259 of the education law to have a municipal ballot vote or a school district ballot vote in a way that connects with voters and allows them to have a say in how their library is funded.
And the only thing I'll add to it, because I know we want to jump into the opportunity to take questions from the folks as well as pre-submitted questions, but it's all possible and it all can be realized. Within our system, I've been doing this work for 10 years now, and 50% of our libraries have been able to increase their funding by 100% or more. Now take into mind, I work in a rural system, so 100% increase in a 5-figure budget is much different than a 100% increase in a multi-million-dollar budget. But it gives you a good understanding that that type of thing can happen. And that's not like kudos to us, to our system. That's kudos to the trustees and the directors within our communities that represent those libraries that rolled up their sleeves and did that really good, important work. And we still have another 20 plus libraries to go that still need to recognize that or realize those benefits. But that's the one thing I want folks to realize within this slide and in this moment. It is absolutely possible. You have to believe in that. You have to fight for it. And it will happen as long as you do the work and you're transparent with your community and you make your community aware of it. Like I said, we've been in those meetings before where they're like, why didn't you bring this to us years ago? We would have been supportive then, just like we're trying to be supportive now. We just need to know all the facts. So please, after we get through tonight, talk with the library infrastructure that exists within New York State. It is a beautiful thing. We have public library systems as well as other library system types that are here to support you. We have a state library and the Division of Library Development that have worked with public library systems to develop this infrastructure and advocate for the legislation to support this infrastructure. So please take advantage of those resources so that your libraries can go after the sustainable funding that they need and that your community members deserve.
And one of those resources that Brian's referring to is the Public Library District Toolkit, which Jerry and I worked on. That was our pandemic project, which really lays out all of the options, the paths forward, answers a lot of questions you may have on this topic, and really sets a new benchmark by the state library there of having library operating revenue, really 90% of it being voter directed. So really not assuming that we have to fundraise these gaps and really using the law in the way it was intended to create libraries that meet the needs of our communities. So I thank Brian for his passion on the topic, because when I visited his system about 10 years ago, and he pulled out a very simple spreadsheet that showed what people actually paid for library services in their community. And it backed up something I had heard through over 250 focus groups I've held here in the Mid-Hudson Library System, which is most taxpayers don't know how much they pay for library services. And in those 250 focus groups that I've done in our system, when I would ask people to guess, well, okay, they tell me they don't know how much they pay. Well, could you please guess how much you pay? They, on average, guess double what they actually pay. So you have an education gap as well as a financial gap in many communities. So not being afraid to talk about the finances of the library, using your annual report to educate your voters as to how you use the money, the outcomes you're achieving, and as Brian said, the challenges you may be having, and allowing for community problem solving through those public votes may be a really strong way to make sure the financial legacy that you create while you're on the board is something that you're incredibly proud of. So, Brian, I think we're going to roll into the questions unless you had any other comments you wanted to add here on this slide.
Nope, I'm good. I can't wait to dig into some of these questions.
All right, so I see a bunch have come in, and I'm sure Ron's been hard at work categorizing them. So, Ron, come on back.
And we had a lot of questions. That was great. So as Brian and Rebecca were talking, I dropped a few resources in chat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to list them all right there, just so you have the links if you wanted to copy and paste that for later. A lot of them are within the trustee handbook as well, but go ahead and copy those so you have them. And let's start out with, I have a question that may cover a couple of the items that have come in the Q&A section. And if you do have questions, go ahead and drop them in that Q&A. If we're not able to get to them tonight, we'll try to get to them in a future after party session as well. But I want to start out with asking a few questions about the tax cap. So, this question here, it says, I do not understand the tax cap and what goes into it. So there's a slew of questions under this. So the first one is the library limited to only asking 2% each year? Is that the tax cap that we should be looking at?
So when the tax cap was passed back in 2011, it became known as the 2% tax cap, but it's actually not a literal 2% tax cap. So you might be thinking I can do some back of the envelope math and figure out what the cap would be, but it's actually a formula that has 7 elements to it. Some of which they need to, when I say they, I mean the Department of Budget and Finance and the Office of the State Comptroller need to kind of fill in for you to calculate your cap. But the intent is important to respect, right? We have some of the highest property taxes in the country in New York State, but also because New York State is an older state that's been very responsive to community needs, we need to recognize the public libraries funding that came into be when the property tax cap law was passed were not adequately funded for the most part when that law was put into place. So as we think about a 2% cap, which is not a literal 2% cap, it's calculated through this form that the state puts out each year, which does not come out usually on a timeline that's beneficial to your planning process at the library, given the variety of fiscal planning years our libraries are on. So I think when you think about 2%, that's a moniker for that law, but it's not an actual. As I mentioned before, you might have a 1.5% carryover on top of a calculated tax cap that could bring your cap actually to 3, 4, 5%. So it really depends library to library, the fiscal timeline that you're on, and also you have to take into consideration the kind of chronic underfunding that many of our libraries were confronted with in 2011 when this law was passed as well. So I hope the next question is about how to override the cap, Ron.
We had one question that came in chat about overriding the tax cap, and we have one here too. So the mixture of the questions are, what does it mean to have the board override the tax cap? And from our Q&A section, can you talk about how the board passes the resolution to override the tax cap?
So overriding the cap is not a carte blanche way to increase the tax dollars that come to your library. It's a public acknowledgement that the library is in need beyond what the current cap calculation is. So what you're doing is approving a budget that you're perhaps going to have a tax levy that is based on, that you put in front of the community, and you want to knowingly produce a resolution that says we are asking you for more than the cap, but the public still has the right to say yes or no to that amount of money. So the override is the board's public acknowledgement that they're asking for more than the cap may be. It's also recommended that you do that cap when you are out of alignment with the timeline with which you get the data on this topic. And you'll see answers to questions about the tax cap right in the trustee handbook, because this is a convoluted and perhaps complicated topic for people. And many of you are like, I wish Rebecca would stop talking about this because I'm not following her right now. So the override is really that public declaration that we think or we know we're going over the cap, and we're putting that before the public to either approve or deny that. So the mechanics of actually producing that resolution in a legal way is to do the override resolution before the board approves the budget, and the override resolution must pass by a supermajority of the board in order to be a legally binding resolution.
And just to make sure, I'll say this slowly so it's clear as well, because there is some common misconceptions, particularly on the side of school districts, that when you put up your budget for a vote, let's say through a school district 259 referendum or a school district budget vote, that vote has to pass with a supermajority as well. And that's not true. It just needs to pass with a simple majority, 51 to 49. But Rebecca's correct that when you put up the intent, so that's the vote that takes place internally with your library board, that does need to pass with a supermajority.
So Rebecca and Brian, does our library have its own tax cap, or does it fall under that of the school district or the municipality that where it gets its tax money from?
Each library has its own cap, even if you are within a school district vote or a municipal ballot vote, which often municipal leaders get very nervous that you're going to impact their cap. If you've got a public vote though on your budget, you do not impact the town's cap. And that is really explicitly written with a citation that is not from Rebecca, Jerry, Brian, or Ron, but from the actual state taxation and finance department and office of the state comptroller that you can hand over to your municipal or school district leaders to make it super clear. Library has their own cap.
And I think the one other thing to add to that is, because it goes back to 2 questions ago, is making sure that you have somebody within the organization that is really confident and able to fill out that tax cap every year and trying to find consistency in it. Determining the cap or the rate of inflation by using that calculator is the best way to make your best guesstimate of what that rate of inflation or what that cap is. So making sure whether that is your director, in a lot of cases it is the director because they're the ones that are consistently there filling it out from one year to the next. That's why we also recommended it in our step-by-step approach. But I also know some libraries, if they have a paid bookkeeper or paid treasurer, that's the individual that works with the director and the board president to make sure that it's being filled out correctly. But yes, Rebecca's correct also that every library that has a public vote has to fill out that. You can't allow the school district or the municipality to fill it out on your behalf because because they just feel like doing it.
And that actually leads into another question, which is, did I hear that correctly? That once a library has held a vote, it needs to file a tax cap form even in subsequent years when it may not hold a vote?
Calling all 414 and 259 libraries, yes. If you've ever had a public vote, even if it was just one, you have to file that form annually from this point forward. And there is a significant benefit to doing that because if you had not asked for an increase in the previous year, there's something called an allowable carryover, which gives you an additional 1.5% on your cap calculation the next year you do go out. So I think that it's important to get it done, but also for public transparency purposes, it needs to be done as well. But it also speaks to the fact that you probably should be going out for a vote every year because that's what the law intends.
Yeah, and the one thing I'll add to that too is the state comptroller's office will let you know when you don't fill it out. It may take them some time to actually issue that reminder, but we do know that the comptroller's office audits that information that's submitted. And if a library misses a year, they will reach out to that library to let them know that they have not submitted. The other thing I'll say is the comptroller's office is really helpful in helping libraries get set up with the tax cap form and also asking surface level questions about that form. So please don't think of it as something that you should be intimidated in terms of reaching out to the comptroller office to get that help and information. They have a great 1-800 support line. And, normally in my experiences and the people that I've talked with that have worked with those folks at the comptroller's office, they're actually pretty friendly and responsive and helpful.
Nice. Well put, Brian. So I'm going to jump into the questions that people are asking because we have about 23 of them that have been submitted. So keep them coming, everybody, if you have more. Starting right from the top, can a public library pay the Library Foundation president for conducting children's programs if funds are coming from the operating budget? So this may be a little conflict of interesty.
So let me make sure I got this right. The question is, can we pay the president of the Library Foundation to produce programming for the community out of the library's operating budget? So
Correct.
I think this is as I think you identified right away, an issue of conflict of interest and perception of conflict of interest, right? So you have someone who is in a position of authority over finances that majorly impact the library, producing a service that perhaps was not bid out and was perhaps not agreed to in the most transparent way. And I'm just guessing there in that situation. I'm not saying that's absolutely the case, but I would say to avoid the perception of special treatment, of an insider's club, of them getting a sweet deal because they do this volunteer work for the library, you would want to avoid that type of situation. Just like no trustee should be financially benefiting from their relationship with the library, I would say no Library Foundation member should be personally financially benefiting from their involvement in a library.
Yeah, duty of loyalty.
Well put. This next question I like. I always love fundraising questions. Beyond the operating budget, what is the best way for a small library without a development office to mount an effective, large and small donor capital fundraising campaign?
How long do you have here? How much time do we have left here to
We're getting there.
So I'm happy to start with this one, Brian. I know you've got experience with this as well, but I think that I heard specifically a capital fundraising campaign, which most association libraries are confronted with at some point in their history. My recommendation is to have a separate campaign committee because it's a little too much for a library board to do that on top of their governing duties. But it's a good reminder to always be building your lists. Of doing for association libraries, doing annual donation campaigns where you're gathering names of people all the time to build that list, to start that work and how you do that work. So when you think about where money comes from capital campaigns, it's primarily from major grants and from small donations, but you need those major grants often to get the small donations. So it's sometimes what order in which you do this work. There's lots of great information out there about how to run a capital campaign. Maybe this is a topic we put on the future docket for the Trustee Handbook book series. We're going to be talking about bonding, of course, for capital projects later in the year. But I think just a short and sweet, how do you get a campaign off the ground? Separate campaign committee, really strong members of that capital campaign committee that are well connected in the community, both in terms of being well respected and deeper pockets, but also really understanding how to structure a campaign in a way that's going to be where you put your time is the most effective. Over time, you want to make sure you create opportunities for every level of giving possible in your campaign, but you have to do it in a way that's really, really smart. Your system staff can usually consult with you on this. There's also some other great resources I'm happy to recommend offline.
Yeah, and I think if we were just talking about operating fundraising, so like from one year to the next, and I know that Rebecca and Jerry have touched upon this before, is for a library board, regardless of library type, focusing on securing sustainable funding and going after public vote and public funding sources is the best use of a governing role. It's not a fundraising board, it's a governing board. But when it does come to capital campaigns, that governing board does need to be involved in that process because there's a legal and fiscal responsibility to make sure that that capital campaign group or that capital campaign committee is acting on, representing the library well. And the one thing that I'll just add to what Rebecca said is just making sure that there's a specific time frame for the work that's being involved in that. So I have seen times where a capital campaign committee is formed and then they're 3 years into it. Normally the intent of a capital campaign committee is, a 12-month process and wrapping up on the 18th month with any, final donors that might be just like trickling in at the end. But normally it's a good 3 to 4 months of planning, 3 to 4 months of going out there and knocking on the doors and shaking hands and networking and getting, big donors to come in and commit to the project, and then wrapping it up in, months 12 through 14.
I like this next question because it talks about kind of the roles and responsibilities when it comes to what the board versus the director are looking at in terms of making sure the library has adequate funding. And the question is there a distinction between the trustee's duty to make sure adequate funding exists versus making that part of the executive director's job to have fundraising / development on their job description? So could you talk a little bit about the duties board versus the director when it comes to securing adequate funding?
Brian, I'm going to ask if you wanted to start this one because you really designed that answer already.
Yeah, so going back to the 9 responsibilities of trustees in the handbook, fiscal responsibility and securing adequate funds to run the library, that falls under the responsibilities of trustees. But again, the person that wears the director hat for the last 20 years, the director has to be actively involved in that process. You know, when we've gone through sustainable funding campaigns, you know, whether that's a 259 referendum or rechartering like an association library to become a school district public library, the director has to be directly involved in that process and going out and helping community members understand the financial house of the organization, what the outcomes of that campaign are going to look like in terms of service, that community members, if they're going to buy into it and back it, you know, that you know, good things are going to come. And, you know, but I think that's a unified voice. So I think it's one of those shared duties and responsibilities that the director and the board share through that type of a process, because there's just things that community members are going to ask or need to know that trustees aren't just going to have that information. And so having the director there in partnership to answer those questions just lends to more transparency of the organization. But also, you know, the director is a paid employee. So, you know, having community or trustees there that are advocating to community members, and the trustees aren't paid to do this work, but they're, you know, they're an ally and indicating that this is important for the library and the community and the long-term viability of the community and the library. You know, that also lends credibility to the director's story as well.
This is a little bit of a long one, so let's see what we got. So under the investment of funds in the handbook, so they read the handbook. That's really great. You list 3 financial vehicles available to libraries. They understand CDs, which are certificates of deposit, but what are the examples of some obligations guaranteed by the United States ? Savings bond ? Also, what does obligations of municipalities and other municipal corporations mean? Thanks. You know what all those mean, Rebecca?
You got that. You got that, Rebecca. That's
So those are direct quotes from General Municipal Law, Section 10 in New York State law. So when you take a look at that language, you can see it's aging. So some of those terms and vehicles were far more common, maybe 50, 60 years ago than they are today, right? You're not seeing a lot of saving bonds being purchased by libraries these days. The main thing to keep in mind is that you want very low risk vehicles if you're doing investments of public dollars. So as we think about what are those options today, there's not many of them. And that law really makes sure you understand it's extremely restricted. So the terminology may not be familiar to you. I do think it's a bit out of date. If you call your local banker and you start chatting with them about what your options are, they'll be able to translate for you into today's language.
I'm getting 4.1% on my CDs right now. I'm feeling pretty good about that.
Way better, right?
You had mentioned this, and I just want to clarify because a question came in. So reserve funds from taxpayers cannot be invested in any way, but it seems like you said that they can be invested in this limited scope way that you were just describing.
Right. So again, I saw Jill just ask the question. It's General Municipal Law Section 10 defines the investment vehicles that are allowable for public funds. Association libraries, while you're not held to that as well, I would say that if you're receiving a fair amount of public money, you would not want to deviate from that same exact law. Association libraries that are doing a lot of fundraising for whatever reason, you can use higher risk investment vehicles for sure, because you're not putting the public money at risk, but you're willing to take maybe a bigger chance with money that came in from donors. Either way, you need some advice. So I would say that it should not be the wild, wild west of investment for association libraries. You need to have someone who really understands investment strategies and the vehicles that you're using and is reading the market for you. And sometimes you're lucky enough to have someone on your board that is helpful with that. But I would say at the end of the day, what everyone needs to understand is we cannot put public money at risk. The public has entrusted us with that money, and it should be being put to good use. And if there's low risk opportunities, like Ron mentioned, the 4.5% on a CD, go for it, as long as you can get it out in time to use it in the manner it was intended to be used.
You need a policy to go along with that?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah.
Let's keep talking about reserve funds for just a minute. So I got two questions that had come in. So this library has a substantial endowment fund, but none of it are reserved. I'm guessing that they don't have individual reserve funds that go along with it. Is that a problem? So I think this is the difference between endowment funds versus what are within the library's reserves.
So I'll just say that usually endowments are set up with parameters, right? There's usually a very generous donor, or a board created the endowment fund with a community foundation, or maybe as a standalone. And there should be a policy or legal documentation to the origin statement of that endowment fund and what is its intended use. There's often parameters in terms of how much can be drawn down from it and on what frequency, and what it's to be used for would be designated by the donor that established the endowment fund. If it was established by the Board of Trustees, there should be a policy related to the endowment fund that defines its acceptable uses and the acceptable expenditure patterns that come out of it.
And I think Rebecca brings up a good point. Like, that's ideal world, but we also know that there's libraries out there that have those endowments in place that language and those parameters may not necessarily exist by the person that gave that gift to the library many years ago. So this is a great notice of like opportunity to develop those parameters moving forward, because you as current trustees are being mindful of that and recognizing that those parameters should probably be in place, but future trustees won't acknowledge it because they're not hanging out with us here tonight. So, putting those parameters in place through a policy is a really good thing. And then also just, forget about ideal world. Let's just talk about best practices. Like, that endowment was set up for the intention of making sure that it can be realized and taken advantage of by future generations, not just the current one. So, in misinterpreting an endowment for a capital reserve fund or, just a rainy day fund is not the right thing to do. You want to make sure that endowment sticks around for future generations. So, just using those dividends or those interests to help support the operations of the library is the best practice, and stay away from that principle.
Brian brings up something that just jogged my memory. I've had two cases in my system of libraries with endowment funds that were set up over 100 years ago. And when the director's like hands are tied by an endowment, like they're only allowed to buy books about sewing with $1 million endowment. And meanwhile, you're watching like the building fall down around you. It's worth it to invest in an attorney to renegotiate the terms of that endowment with the family members tied to the original donor. I know it's a very, very rare thing, and many of you are rolling your eyes right now going, I wish I had that problem, but I'll just say sometimes it's worth getting that legal attorney to untangle it for you.
Wish we had $1 million for books about sewing. My gosh, that was our only problem. Brian and Rebecca, what's a good percentage of the budget? What should we have in our reserve fund? Any thoughts on that one?
Oh, I think it depends. Like it really depends on your situation. I know you hate that answer, everyone, but when you think about your reserve funds in general, they're segmented. You've got reserve funds for cash flow purposes, which means there is a very calculable percentage in terms of what you need for cash flow between the beginning of your fiscal year and when your tax dollars come in. That's something you can see in a pattern over time. It tells you what percentage of your budget you need to have in that reserve. Your capital fund, your capital reserve fund should be based on your board-approved facility plan, which is going to vary from library to library. There's, of course, everyone's favorite 10% contingency fund, which lends itself to some, I think, fungibility in terms of how justifiable that is. So you've got to have some real cases to base some type of fund like that on, but other types of fund I think are pretty predictable based on local circumstances. Brian, do you have other advice on that one?
No, I think just tying it back to the policy all by itself, it all depends on the situation in terms of like what we talked about, multi-year financial planning. We talked about having a strategic plan and having a component of facility planning within that. And so, I think that's the thing that depends. If you're a library that's operating on, let's say, a low six-figure budget, but you know you have a $1.5 million building project that you're striving to go after, obviously you're going to have more than $300,000 in your reserve fund or your capital fund to make that happen. Not all the time, but as you're working your way towards a $1.5 million new building project, yes, you should be building up that capital reserve, because your policy supports that to your community members and indicates why that money's on hand to do that. But like after that building's built, no, maybe you don't have a $500,000 capital reserve fund. Maybe your reserve fund's $150,000 for the maintenance of that new building, and you your policy sets a cap on it. So the one thing I would encourage libraries to do, and I know you do this anyways, but shop around for policies. Go around and look at what other policies are available through libraries' websites, because they should all be up on the websites to begin with. We've got a great capital fund policy that's been circulating around in our system, and you don't have to make these policies overly comprehensive so that nobody can understand them. That's quite the opposite of what you want them to be. You want them to be, one page front and back at the most, that really dictates and helps trustees and directors understand, as well as the community, because they're the people that are also going to be reading it, so that they can understand exactly why you have that money in the bank and what it's intended for. And it may rise and it may fall depending upon what your goals are.
All right. Rebecca, I love it when you say that it depends to questions, mainly because I think what that does is it allows people to consider, like, what's the real circumstance that they're dealing with their library. And when you're talking about financial planning and budgeting, what are the circumstances? And it depends kind of gives you an ability to dive a bit deeper. And I think when Rebecca gives answers like that, like, here are all the things that you should think about, you're able to formulate a much better path forward than if we were just to say, you have to do it this way. So I would take those, read the trustee handbook, consider your situations, and that's where a lot of your answers are going to come from, which I think is really great. Brian, you mentioned policies, and I know that one of the questions that came up a couple times in the Q&A is, can you post a sample budget amendment policy? And what you were saying is that you shop around and you kind of find them. Do you have any idea where a good budget amendment policy is, Brian or Rebecca?
I was going to look at Rebecca and say the Mid-Hudson website.
Well, just a word about budget amendment policies, right? Your mileage may vary based on the size of your budget. So
it depends.
It depends. So we get t-shirts made. I think when you take a look, that's why you always have to be looking at those samples in context of understanding this is a library with a $50 million budget compared to a library with a $200,000 budget. Your budget amendment thresholds are going to look different in those two situations. So I think making sure you're getting samples from libraries that are serving a similar size community or have a similar size budget is going to be important. And also testing that at your finance or policy committee. Like, what do we find reasonable as a bunch of reasonable adults from this community to say, like, oh yeah, if you wanted to make a 75% adjustment, yeah, you're definitely coming back to us. If you want to make a 1% adjustment, I think the director can handle that one.
Very good. We've talked a bit about these different policies. Rebecca, when you're looking at it, do you typically have financial policies? Does it go through the finance committee, or do you have it go through your finance and your policy committee when you're kind of doing that development?
Oh, super good question. I would say in practice, the finance committee is probably going to oversee those because they understand better the financial picture of the organization. So it is a subset of policies, just like your personnel policies might actually go through your personnel committee and not a standalone policy committee. Honestly, I find policy committees less and less frequent. I find the committees more specialized in topics, and they handle the policies most close to their charge for their committee.
Well said. So we have a situation, who can my board go to? And I'm going to kind of paraphrase this a little bit. So we have a municipal library that's treated as a department of the village. And who should we talk to about kind of clarifying the roles and responsibilities of the trustees and the library being its own standalone entity?
Oh, the precious municipal public libraries. Every time we do these sessions, we all get off this call and we debrief. We're like, oh, the poor municipal public libraries.
Poor Jerry always has something to say about those.
I know, where's Jerry right now? But when you don't have your finances fully separated from the town or the village, whatever municipality that you're tied to, it gets messy. So Ron, if I'm not mistaken, the question is, how do you work towards that separation and building, I don't want to say a wall between it, but more clarity in terms terms of responsibility and oversight in these situations. And I think that, it sometimes is going to be personality dependent in these situations, but a town supervisor usually is fairly excited to think that some responsibility will be off their plate. And if they're not, there's a different situation going on there. So I would say in our system, that has been the case in all but 3 cases for municipal libraries, where a town supervisor, once approached, was like, yes, please, let's work on this together and figure out how to make this happen. So they're just giving an annual appropriation to the library out of the town's budget, and the library board takes it from there, just like a district or an association library does.
Yeah, and my natural knee-jerk reaction, and the optimist in me said that we'll just sit down with the town council or the city council and just hash it out and help them understand like how things operate. And that's been the experience within our system as well for the few municipal public libraries that we have, where in most administrations within that municipality are happy to see the library kind of go out from underneath that arm and operate completely on its own, including the whole financial component of it. And really at that point, the role is just, I don't want to just say just, but the connection between the municipality and the library is the appointment of library trustees. And that's about the level of that connection. But it's tough, and because there's an educational component to it, and also administrations change, where you do have a mayor or town council member that is happy to see the library go away, but then you've got one that's like, no, I love my library and I want to have complete control over it, and within this administration, and so that dynamic might change too. So the sooner that you can kind of pull away from it, and it's not that we don't want to partner with our municipalities or that we don't love the work that they do, it's just we know that they have great priorities just as much as we have priorities. So if we can help them focus on their priorities and we focus on our priorities as libraries, I think everybody's best off.
And a word to the wise, I know we talked about this when we did our session in January last year, but I will just remind folks who might be in this situation, who are looking to segregate more of the responsibility of the finances in a municipal public library section, be sure to do a thorough assessment of in-kind help that your municipality is giving you, and put a dollar value on that, because chances are a lot of those things are just easier because all the funds are commingled. And once those are separated, there might be a charge for those things. They may no longer be so willing to do some of those things on the side for you. So having a reality check about that relationship before ever approaching the municipality about it will be important.
Yeah, we have those discussions. I mean, shared service is a wonderful world in our current day of government, but at the same exact time, there is a true cost of those shared services, and that's a negotiation process, or that's like almost like a grieving process for a library that's trying to get out from underneath that arm. Is you have to concede to the fact that because that's a negotiation process, that you're going to have to give things up, and you might have to actually start paying for things if you want to bring more power to the table of the library board.
I think we made somebody a little nervous. This came in as an anonymous. So can we retroactively file the tax cap form after we've already had a public vote that passed the budget? Are there penalties or consequences? Says anonymous.
There are penalties and consequences, anonymous, but I would say, to Brian's point, first, give the Office of the State Comptroller the benefit of the doubt. Give them a call and say, we think we've made an honest mistake here. We didn't realize X, Y, Z about the process. We just went to this workshop. We heard we're supposed to be doing this. Oh my goodness, we didn't. Can you help me? And in my experience so far, they've been very willing to help you out of that situation. There will come a point in time in New York State where it will not be so kind. Because the law will have been in place now going on over a decade, and there won't be too many more excuses to not understand how that works in the future. In the law, what you see written in is a library or any entity that willfully or perhaps unknowingly, but just screwed up because they didn't understand the law, do this. There will be a penalty where a reserve fund, not of a fund kind, needs to be created. So you're going to be paying back the community the increased amount you received without that authorization. So I would say, first, call, own it, give them a chance to help you out, but do understand there is a mechanism there to hold you responsible, and that could be coming someday from the Office of the State Comptroller. But so far, so good for libraries that are figuring it out. But again, it might not be that way forever.
Yeah, and just to reiterate Rebecca's point, I've observed situations where libraries have gone multiple years without filing that tax cap form, and they did that exact same thing. They reached out to the state comptroller's office. We're just honest and truthful, and the state comptroller really helped them out. But we're going into year 11 now with tax cap legislation, so that's been an interesting thing to work with.
I've only been in libraries, well, yeah,
Oh, Ron.
a few more than 11 years. So I've always known it this way. It hasn't always been this way.
Well, I think there was a lot of hope that it was going to sunset. When it first was passed, it said it would sunset. And a lot of us were like, all right, well, yeah, I'll figure this out if I have to. But now you have to. It's the clear signs from Albany. This is permanent. So I think moving forward, you need to assume this is reality and figure it out and move forward from there.
And I mean, it is favorable legislation. I mean, partisanship aside, and whoever's in the executive branch aside, like we've learned, we've been under 2 governors now with this legislation in place, and we've met with our elected officials through an advocacy standpoint, and it's favorable legislation because it's our legislators doing their very best to keep us accountable at the local level.
All right. I thought public libraries can't fundraise and the foundation had to do it on the library's behalf or friends group. Is that the case?
I swear to God, I get asked this question every single year. I've been in libraries for 25 years. So again, public dollars cannot be used for fundraising purposes. The purpose of your library director is to run a library. The purpose of your library board is to govern that library. So fundraising really ideally is going to be done by a friends group, separately incorporated, or for major fundraising and larger libraries are going to have a foundation that is the fundraising arm of the library. So I think there's these, and I know we went over and over and over it the first time we did this topic through the series, but you need to keep in mind the intent of public dollars is to produce public service. Fundraising may be necessary in your situations, but segregating that from your public entity status and really making sure the focus is done properly by volunteers is important in this world. And so if you find as a governing board, you're spending a lot of time fundraising, you need to go back to the slides we talked about sustainable funding and recalibrate your percentages.
Yeah, and I think that's why we drew the hard line in the sand between operational fundraising and capital fund fundraising. So again, capital fund fundraising, that is for a very specific period of time. It's actually being done in partnership with a capital campaign committee, folks that aren't on the library board, and the library board's kind of overseeing or helping to organize that process. But operational fundraising, absolutely, it should be done through a friends group or it should be done through a foundation. It should not be done by elected or appointed trustees.
So I'm going to kind of mash a few questions together on this one. And this is actually one of the pre-submitted ones that we had too. So how do we get to this 90% of operating revenue from voters if we're so far behind? Is it something where we should do one big ask, or should it be something that's broken up over a few years? And in today's political climate, do you see that library votes are succeeding less often than they used to?
Say it with me, folks. It depends. and I'm going to ask Brian to talk about this because he's so good at this. He's a tactician when it comes to the strategy on this answer, because it depends on your political climate, the economic wherewithal, how well you tell the story of what you need. And it's really the difference, right, Brian? I think you call it the difference between a funding campaign and just a routine passage of your operating budget.
And I'm glad, because we're coming up on 6:20. I was like, when are we going to get the questions about sustainable funding? So whoever threw that question out there, kudos to you. Yeah, it does depend. It depends on the library situation too. There's, we as a system get called in to help assist the library go through, a funding referendum campaign. So whether that be a 259 or 414, within our system, all of our libraries, with the exception of 2, align with 259 school district boundaries, because that's what just makes the most sense for our community. And then we have several school district public libraries. And so, when we get called into that situation, the first thing we have to do is go through several our objective litmus tests. Like, we really need to identify that the library is doing good work and that they have a strategic plan in place, and that they're engaged with the community and trying to do the things that a library is supposed to do. And the only reason that maybe they are potentially falling short on things is because, why this person who asked the question, the library is underfunded. And in those situations where we see everything is kind of like a green light and the library is doing good work, then, yeah, it's time to make that business plan pitch to the community. And really that's what I hope trustees think of it is, you going out and educating the community about why the library is underfunded, how much people actually pay for library taxes within the community to support that library, which I guarantee for most of you, it is less than 1.5% of total property taxes. And, so what does it look like when you do go double that? So now you're 3% of total property taxes. And again, you need to be sensitive to the region of the state that you're in and how you're going about things. But so I think that's like a really good place to start, is to identify, like, do we have a good solid strategic plan in place? Have we been working through that strategic plan over the last couple of years? Objectively, are we doing good work? Have we seen, if not, an increase in circulation, at least flat circulation? Are we offering great programs, and are people attending those programs? What does the library door count look like? Are we going out into the community and have part of open house night at the school district, and are at the farmers market and doing great outreach? And are we connecting with different agencies to build partnerships? If all that stuff's going on, green light. And talk with your local library system to help identify the best practices for moving that type of thing forward. But then, there's some libraries that are not in that position yet, where they need to make sure that they are doing that good work. And that might mean some incremental changes, both with how the board conducts themselves from like a roles and responsibilities standpoint, as well as how the board works with the director to work with staff to like make sure that some of those objective benchmarks are being met in terms of what is a really good performing library. With the exception of maybe a few regions within our state, at least, I've always worked in upstate New York, above Mid-Hudson Library System. And, for the most part, most of our rural libraries are grossly underfunded. It's why I get excited about doing the work that I do every day, because that was the first thing that I connected with when I was a 24-year-old library director. I was like, you got to be kidding me right now. Like, let's get out there and beat the drums, and let's make sure people recognize that, our civic spaces, our public libraries need to be funded. And so, yeah, I'll digress at this moment because I could keep going on and take us past 6:30. So.
But I think Brian's point about testing your public reputation, and this is why it is all connected, right? When we think about our marketing strategy, do we have a really strong email list? Are we getting the word out? Do we do a really strong annual report to the community? All of these things help to build up to that moment where you might want to address a major funding issue. If you don't have that build up to that point, it will take you multiple years, and you'll continue to kind of tread water for many, many years.
Brian, you teased us a bit. What happens if the board does not come together on the budget in your step 4?
I asked you guys to ask that question, so that is awesome. Thanks, Ron. Or maybe Ron was taking notes. Thank you, Ron.
No, it was there. Somebody asked it.
Yeah. I first and foremost, I would follow open meetings law. So making certain that, you do want to try to do your very best to pass that budget before the beginning of your fiscal year, because the last thing you want to do is to enter that fiscal year without giving your director and your staff the permission slip to go spend money, without board authorization. So take a look at open meetings law as to how you would set up a special meeting to pass that. And then, really do the heart-to-heart talk about like what that budget negotiation looks like. And negotiations are exactly that. Everybody has to concede a little bit of something to make sure that those budget priorities work. And that includes the director, that includes the treasurer and the independent auditor and of the organization, as well as the board president. So regardless of your role, in an ideal world, everybody comes to some type of compromise in that last hour, or at least within those last 15 days, to make it work by following open meetings law and being transparent, so that when you do pass that budget, it's in an open meeting and the minutes reflect. I don't know,
Rebecca. I thought that was good.
That was good.
Yeah, Rebecca, what's a 259 library?
A 259 library is a library that perhaps is most likely an association library that is using section 259 of education law, which allows that library to place a funding initiative on the ballot of the school district. So you're funded along school district boundaries. The school district collects the taxes and turns them over to the library, but it doesn't change your governance model to a school district public library. So that's what a 259 library is usually referred to. It's confusing because a municipal ballot vote, which many of us call a 414 vote, is also found in section 259 of education law, but 259 library usually means you're having a vote along school district boundaries using the ballot option rather than becoming a district.
Very good. Very good. And I guess this is kind of this will be our last kind of closeout question. So you talked a lot about planning, your financial planning, budgeting. You talked about kind of creating the ideal budget for moving forward and putting it on the ballot. How can we move forward? What's the best way to talk with the community or convince them that the library is a service worth funding when we go to that ballot vote, when we put that effort in there? And how do we figure out how much they are paying for the service? Basically, what are your heartfelt feels on how do we talk to the community about these budgets that we've worked painstakingly hard to put together, and we try to convince them that this is a resource that we're looking to fund?
Yeah, I'll just share that one of the things I've learned over the years with campaigns, which I think I've been involved in over 100 at this point, is that you've got to have a little something for everyone in terms of your storytelling techniques. So you have people out there that really appreciate data, who really want to see the numbers and understand them. You have other people that are going to glaze over when you start talking like that. They need to understand the stories behind the numbers and the outcomes that you are achieving with the dollars invested in the library. I cannot highly enough recommend Project Outcome from the Public Library Association. It is a free survey resource professionally designed for public libraries to generate outcome-based evaluation. It boggles my mind why more people don't use this. It helps you tell the story and the impact you're actually having with your programs and services. And then you've also got very visual folks in the community that are going to need not a spreadsheet, but something more visual, whether it's the pie chart, whether it's the photograph of the children. You've got to have a mixture of these three techniques of the visual, the storytelling on impacts, as well as the data to help make your case. And the key thing I'm going to say here, and I hope you hear me and understand where I'm coming from, is do not assume anything. Even your library users do not know how much they pay in taxes to your library. And I am not calling them dumb. I am not saying they don't read their tax bill. I'm just saying, if you ask them, man on the street, do you know how much you pay for the library? 9 times out of 10, they're going to say no. So you need to educate your users and your voters as to how much they currently pay, what the impact of that investment is on the community, and what you're going to do with a higher level of investment in the future, and build that trust so that when you say those words, they really believe that you're going to get those outcomes for that community.
I'm just going to leave it at that. I think Rebecca said it perfectly and actually fantastically. And I do think we need a session on sustainable funding all by itself.
Brian's been saying that since day one.
That brings us to 6:30. I want to thank everybody for attending tonight. Brian, thank you so much for coming and sharing the stage. Rebecca, thank you so much for providing all of your wonderful information that you have. I want to mention I put the midhudson.org/trustee book club link in the chat. We have strategic planning coming up on Tuesday, August 15th at 5 o'clock. In October, we're going to be talking about equity, diversity, inclusion, and access and justice. And then to close out the year in December, we're going to be talking about financing and managing construction projects. And I'm pretty sure we have our good pal Jerry Nichols coming back for that one, right? So we should have a really good time for the rest of the year, where we'll be talking about all kinds of trustee education items. Don't forget to read the trustee handbook, submit questions ahead of time, and we hope to see you back here for strategic planning on August 15th. Thank you so much, everybody, for stopping by tonight. We appreciate it.
Thank you,
Thanks,
Ron.
everyone.
Thank you, everyone.